Reverend Spy by D P Denton, Chapter 6. So many things happened within the next few days that Dan could not even recall them later. He managed to get acquainted with the ministers in K that were cooperating with the enemy, and began to learn of their superiors in other cities. When his suspicions were aroused concerning some minister in another place, he fed the information to 35 by way of his transmitter, and by the time the war was over, quite a number of them had been identified as supporters of the alien interests. It was quite dismaying to him to find that some of them had wormed their way into fundamental, conservative, and even holiness churches, and some were even in places of leadership. An appointment was made at the distant church, and his bus schedule transmitted to 35. On the day of his departure, Lori wondered at the large bag he carried and the extra clothing for such a short engagement. But she was a good wife and made no issue of it. In the big city, he made the switch from his normal appearance to his disguise, and when he again walked through the waiting room, some who knew him did not even recognize him. While standing in line waiting to board his bus, he kept an eye open for signs of his contact. Suddenly, his heart almost stopped. At the head of the line, just a few feet from him, was his roomer, the super spy whom he had been covering for these last few months. For the next few minutes, a mad rush of thoughts raced through his mind. Had he slipped up somewhere? Was he being led into a trap? Had the enemy agent recognized him? Where was the fellow going anyway? Was he shadowing him and planning to confront him when the opportunity presented itself? How would he be able to stay away from him when they were on the bus? A mess of confused thoughts took possession of his mind for a few minutes, and then he calmed down and decided just to meet events as they transpired. The driver arrived and began to take the tickets and to move the passengers aboard. Out of the corner of his eye, Dan noted that the agent took a place just 3 rows behind the driver's seat, and he breathed somewhat easier. In the rush of boarding passengers, if he could get past him without being recognized, everything would be all right. Just as he boarded and started down the aisle, there was some kind of confusion outside the bus, and the agent pressed his face to the window to see. While his head was turned, Dan went toward the rear of the bus and found 2 seats that were empty. Seating himself next to the aisle and crossing his legs so as to discourage others from taking the seat next to him, he waited for his contact. "Pardon me, sir, is this seat taken?" And at that voice, Dan looked up into the face of a man whom he knew instinctively was 67. Moving to the seat next to the window so as to better block the view of the enemy agent down front, Dan made room for his contact. When they were comfortably seated and the bus was moving out onto the road, Dan opened his briefcase, pulled out a scratch pad, and prepared to write. "Have you seen any good movies lately?" came the query that Dan expected. "No," was the answer, much to the surprise of the other. "But let me show you something that I saw in a magazine recently. It went something like this." And while the other sat in wonderment and puzzled over the turn of events, Dan drew on his pad a large box affair that would throw any onlookers off his track, and then, while drawing, wrote in fine words what he wanted to convey to the agent. When 67 realized what he was doing, he sat forward in his seat and leaned over as to shield the scratch pad from any prying eyes. Between drawings, Dan conveyed to 67 the news that their man was on the bus and where he was sitting. With that, 67 stood up and fumbled for something among the baggage on the overhead rack, meanwhile stealing quick glances toward the front seat. While thus shielded by the body of 67, Dan peered down the aisle for a look at his erstwhile roomer and was very much surprised to see that his seat companion was a nice-looking woman and that they were in a very earnest conversation. 67 slipped back into his seat and let out a deep breath. Leaning low and talking very quietly, he whispered, "Boy, there's something big cooking at the development tonight. That woman is the wife of their biggest agent in this country. We have had her covered for several days now. Her shadow is on here too, but don't act as though you knew anything. There's also another one of our men on here, and he must have someone on here that he is covering. It looks as though this bus is loaded for bear. Let me think a minute." For a few minutes he sat in deep thought, then whispered, "This bus goes through the development area. No one is allowed off except those with permits. The woman must have false permits for all of her agents. Keep your eyes open. I want you to stay with me. I'll prepare you a permit. We must not lose those folk, for they will lead us to the headquarters of their operations against us in this project. I don't know how we'll do it, but we'll have to manage somehow. Here, let me borrow your scratch pad." While a wondering and somewhat frightened Dan looked on, he wrote 2 or 3 pages of notes, folded them into an odd-shaped size, and then settled back to watch and wait. When the bus neared the development area, 67 reached across and opened the window a few inches while Dan watched and wondered. At the boundary line of the area, a stop was made and guards gave the bus a good inspection, even opening the baggage compartment, while 2 guards came aboard to ride through the area and be sure that no one got off without a proper pass. As the outside guards came around the bus to make their inspection, 67 quietly reached his hand out of the window, and one of them very quickly took the folded papers and hid them in the palm of his hand. "Good," said 67. "Now we'll have help when we get off here." And Dan found himself thanking God for the rapid means of communication which they had to use. As the bus moved again, Dan's excitement grew. Here was the area about which 35 had told him. Here they were getting ready to produce a destructive power different and more terrible than anything the world has ever known before. If it was successful and worked as planned, it could give us victory almost instantly and would in the future, no doubt, change the entire history of the world. It is no wonder, thought Dan, that our enemies and some of our so-called friends are trying to steal this secret, and it is no wonder that they are willing to go to any lengths and suffer any risks to get it. Whoever controls this will control the world. The story of the next few days cannot be fully told. Suffice it to say that the best-kept secret in the United States has ever had was almost lost even before it became a reality. The number of foreign agents who had infiltrated this government complex was far greater than the Bureau even dreamed was possible. The traitors within our own government who were cooperating with them reached astonishing proportions and into some of the higher offices in the nation. But before Dan saw the outside world again, he was told by one of our agents that all of the enemy had been identified. A number of them had been arrested and put where they could do no harm. And best of all, the top enemy agents inside of our nation had been located and were under constant surveillance. Years later, some of them were tried and punished as a result of the information gathered during these historic few days. As for Dan, he felt those few days had enough excitement and danger to last him for the rest of his life, and he longed for the peace and quiet of a small pastorate. But that was not to be again. He was now a marked man. He would never forget the feeling of the small but powerful pistol which 67 pressed into his hands before they left the bus, nor the roll of money slipped into his pocket for expenses. He would always remember the cloak and dagger trip over the newly built city trying to cover a quarry that seemed to sense that he was being followed. He would always clearly remember checking into that big wooden hotel right behind his game and how he managed to get a room right next to theirs. He would always wonder where and how he lost 67 and the other agents and found himself alone in a room next to the most dangerous spies in the world. He was to keep in his memory for the rest of his life how he made a makeshift wall stethoscope and sat for hours listening to their conversation and making notes on what he could understand. Part of the time the conversation was in English, and part of it in some other language, which he felt sure was Russian. But what notes he did get were dynamite. Fortunately, as he made the notes, he folded them sheet by sheet and put them in his inside coat pocket, for his eavesdropping came to a sudden and almost disastrous end. After several hours of intent listening and writing, his wits did not react too quickly, and when a knock came at the door, he foolishly answered it with the pad and the homemade monitoring device in his hands. Just a red cap looking for a tip, he thought as he closed the door, but as soon as he placed his listening device and his ear back to the wall, he heard the red cap relating to the folk in the next room what he had seen. A shiver of fear swept over him, and he felt frozen, but suddenly realized that he had to act at once. Springing into action, he quickly locked the door, and then pushed a small chest of drawers against it. Nervously, he shifted the small pistol to a side pocket and silently prayed that he would not have to use it. Just as he did, a rap came to the door. "What is it?" he had called, knowing full well what it was. "Evening paper for you, sir?" came a voice that was hard to disguise. "Thank you, but I don't want one," Dan replied. "But I need to check the supplies in your room," came an impatient voice. "My room is all right. You can check it tomorrow." And Dan knew that this could not go on long, as while they talked, he had been looking for some way out of his second-story room. The voice outside dropped all pretense of politeness or disguise and said, "Well, I'm coming in anyway." And with that, an attempt was made to turn the knob. When they found the door locked, they began to shove against it, and Dan knew that experienced spies such as they were would soon have it opened. He had just pulled his gun and prepared for the worst when two unexpected but very welcome things took place. Suddenly, from down the hall, a terrific noise came, accompanied with running feet, cursing, and other tumult. This stopped the attack on the door temporarily. Dan was to learn later that one of his compatriots had hired two men to stage a drunken fight down the hall. At the same time, Dan became conscious that someone was pecking on the window, and looking around, he was delighted to see the face of 67. Throwing open the window, Dan took in the situation and lost no time in getting out. A ladder had been lying at the back of the building, and 67 had thrown it up to make the rescue. When they reached the ground, 67 grabbed Dan by the hand and pulled him close to the building. "Hug the building," he whispered, "and make it to the front. I'll cover for you and join you." Dan had kept hidden as best as he could and found a cab waiting with open door. He had scarcely gotten in until 67 landed next to him, and the cab rushed away. As the cab went around the corner, Dan looked down the backside of the hotel and saw his renter Spy leaning out of the window of the room which he had just escaped. Several years later, Dan helped to build a church just across the street from that hotel. Many times as he went past, he glanced down the back wall of that hotel building and remembered how God had brought him out of there alive. Speeding down the street in the cab, Dan quickly related what had taken place and gave all of his notes to 67. "I wish I could have destroyed my homemade monitor," he said, "for now they will know for certain what I was doing. Do you think your agent recognized you?" "I'm not sure. I just hope not," was Dan's hopeful reply. "One thing sure," said 67, "you are now a marked man, and will have to make some changes for your own safety. I believe you have helped to crack open something that has had us puzzled ever since this project started, and I am sure that you will be hearing from higher up. By the way, did you know that you are already getting quite a reputation in the Bureau?" "I'm not interested in that," came the weary reply. "I'll be satisfied if I can just help to save our country and then get back to the full-time work of God." "Well," said 67, "I like your spirit, and we don't want to risk losing you. Those fellows and all of their henchmen will be looking for you now, so we're going to send you home in a car, and before you get there, I will have 35 meet you with instructions. This cab is all right. He is one of our men. He will see that you get home, and will also arrange the meeting between you and 35. Goodbye, and good luck to a very brave man." The cab stopped at a corner. There was a warm, firm clasp of the hand, and 67 was gone from Dan's life. The cab moved on with the cabby keeping constant watch in all directions.